GDP, which is the output of the country, that in 2008, 54% of the GDP, that's what the debt equaled. Today, it's 72%. So unemployment's the same. The economy's still, sputtering along. We don't have a lot of growth, but we do have a ton of new debt. And if you look at what the Fed's done, we've got about $3.2 trillion on their balance sheet in these new assets they've been buying. And a lot of these are toxic assets. These are assets that are mortgage-backed securities that nobody else wanted. So you've got basically an economy in the same place it was before, but with a ton of new debt, with a Fed that's got all this money it's got to do something with. And every time they talk about the Fed wants to taper and stop buying all this bonds, all of a sudden the market starts to tank a little bit because Wall Street's getting very addicted to this easy money they've had. So we're in a spot where we really have to make some important changes. And if we don't make those changes, I think we're going down a road very similar to where we see Europe, very much a nationalized state where the government has a very large say in production. It sort of stifles the entrepreneurship that helps this country grow, and it makes it very hard to boost those employment numbers back to where we want to see them. So the question is, how has Obama responded to all of this? Well, we talk about unemployment insurance extensions, and we talk about the minimum wage. None of those things really address the economy in a way that promotes economic growth. Economists talk about, there's two types of unemployment. There's what we call cyclical unemployment, and that goes up and down with the business cycle. As when we had the big boom going on before the housing crash, our employment rates are very high, the labor markets were very tight, and it was very good for the labor force. But at the same time, once the crash happened, we ended up with a labor force that's much smaller and much more difficult to find jobs. But this is cyclical unemployment. The other type of unemployment that economists talk about is structural unemployment. And I think here's the big difference between what the current Obama administration is thinking and what it really takes to get this economy going again. He's dealing with these things like unemployment insurance and the minimum wage as if we're in this situation where cyclical employment is the problem. And as soon as the economy gets enough spending, and of course, all the critics of the free market say, well, the problem is we just haven't had enough. We've got to double down, spend more, have the government spend more and more and more and more. But that doesn't get you out of the problem, especially if we're talking about structural problems in the economy, not the cyclical problems that the president keeps referring to. In fact, when you see these debates, and I'm sure the State of the Union's coming up, he's going to spend a lot of his time talking about unemployment insurance, extending those benefits, these new public-private partnerships that he's talking about. I think he was down in North Carolina, I think last week, promoting another one of those, which is nothing more than the government picking winners and losers in the marketplace, and we know that doesn't work very well over the long run, and we know that doesn't promote economic growth. So it's almost a sideshow to what we really need to do in terms of improving the economy. He's still talking about these things to improve the cyclical problems, but I say, and I think a lot of economists on our side say, no, there's structural problems with the economy. And what are other structural economies? Well, we've got the big ones I would say are taxes. It's hard to do business if you're being taxed to death. It's hard to get businesses off the ground if every time you turn around you got a new tax thrown at you and you can do business overseas cheaper. Suddenly you see these jobs going overseas. And you can't really blame the corporations because they're responding to the federal government's tax code and the penalty that the federal government imposes on them. So that's a big impediment, and it's a structural impediment. It's not a cyclical thing. We have to go back and look at fundamental tax reform as a way to get ourselves out of the hole that we sort of dug for ourselves. Second thing I think we can look at is regulation. I mean, more and more we're turning into a very regulated society. You see Obamacare, of course, that's probably the most obvious, and that hits another thing I'll touch on in entitlements. But Obamacare, you're rejiggering 20% of the economy, and business firms are saying, oh, can I hire somebody? Is it worth hiring somebody at this point? So you've got serious problems there, and that's just the beginning of it. You've got the EPA. I think this summer the new CO2 regulations come out, so you're going to see a real increase in the costs of complying with with the CO2 emission standards, and that, of course, ends up in everybody's electrical bill. So don't be surprised if you see rate increases in your future when it comes to energy. The president keeps pushing, solar power as a solution, but we all know, the sunset, the wind dies, those things can't, provide the energy we need for a vibrant economy. If the government gets out of the way, we're probably the most vibrant energy economy in the world. Through fracking and some of the new technologies we have, horizontal drilling, and our deposits of coal and natural gas, we could be the world's leader. We could be the producer of energy in the world. But that's not the direction that the administration has decided to take. In fact, they're thwarting our efforts in those fields every step of the way. So those are two big areas: taxes, regulations. Another one is just simply demographics. We have a population that's getting older, and as it's getting older, the burdens of the entitlement programs we have are getting bigger and bigger. And rather than address those burdens, or rather than try to reform Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, Obama has simply added another one through Obamacare. So now we have an even larger set of entitlements that are going to run us up into the trillions and trillions of dollars in the next 15 to 20 years. So we're running into some serious problems with the economy, and they're all structural. They're not, as the administration wants to say, cyclical things that you can tinker with the economy. This is the old Keynesian demand-side management, where you can go in and tinker with the economy and ultimately get the goal that you want. I said, no, and this is when Reagan came into office, he sort of swept all of that aside and said, no, we've got problems that make it hard for entrepreneurs to do business in this country. We've got a tax rate that's too high, we've got regulations that stop them at every turn. Let's get rid of those, and we saw a boom go on when that happened. And I think going into the next two elections, it's important to elect the representatives and senators who take that position. Because if we don't, then we're stuck with more of this continuing Obamacare, or the Dodd-Frank regulations. It's just a very unproductive way to try to promote economic growth. So if we look at what we can do, I think it is focused on the structural. And believe it or not, there's some economists who are so pessimistic that they're saying we can never get back to the growth path that we were. So the more that we try to fiddle with these cycles, the more difficult it gets. We're wasting money, spending money we shouldn't be spending, and actually harming the economy. He's a famous economist at Northwestern, Robert Gordon, basically says we've sort of run out of innovation. He says, his theory, he goes back to before 1750, growth was very, very slow. There was not a lot of advantages in the way of, our lifestyle was pretty much the same throughout that whole period. Then we had three big industrial revolutions. The first with steam, second with, electricity, indoor plumbing. That led to air conditioning, led to manufacturing at the levels we did. And then in the 1960s, that was the start of the internet revolution. And he says that that's starting to peak already. And until we get out, he calls them these headwinds of innovation. And he points to regulation, taxes, and demographics as the things that you really have to address if you want to get the economy growing again. Because right now, from his perspective, we're just waiting for that next technological revolution. Otherwise, we're not going to get back to the growth that we once had. And Tyler Cowen, he's a professor at George Mason, has said something very similar. He has a new book out that's called Average is Over. And his point is, all the low-hanging fruit in terms of technology has been picked. And so it's getting more and more difficult to get benefits out of technology. He's a little more optimistic than Robert Gordon says. Eventually we will, and when we do that, growth will pick up, and we'll have a very prosperous, and if not, probably an economy that's much stronger than the economy we have today. But it still takes getting these structural impediments out of the way. It means getting rid of the regulations that are there. It means getting rid of the fundamental tax reform, wipe out all these crazy taxes that everybody has to comply with. I mean, it's so difficult. How many people can ever say that they've never violated an IRS code in filing taxes? I don't think any one of us can, because even the IRS, when you call them up and ask for help, there's been studies, you'll get, they'll do the same question, talk to 2 or 3 different IRS experts, you get 2 or 3 different answers. So that's the tax code, and we can't do business in a global market that's very competitive when you have countries all over the world who have gone through fundamental tax reform. If we're still clinging to this tax code that's, I think 17,000 pages right now, or maybe more. How much? 8,000. I mean, yeah. So it's just hard to do business when you have those kinds of uncertainties hanging over your head. So we have to look for a way forward, and it is addressing these structural problems. And one thing I see that's a real, and I think this is why these next 2 elections are very important, is if you really want to get back to an administration and a Congress that promotes growth, you have to stop the rise of what I call the administrative state. Today, there's so many agencies, these independent agencies, these regulatory agencies, they all are out there producing regulations. And one of the results of this is, and this is something that, and this is why when Harry Reid did the nuclear option and said he's going to go ahead and start appointing judges, this is why it's so important, because these regulations, they're so, the government, the Congress passes the bill, it goes to the regulators, they write the regulations. If there's a problem, it goes to the courts. And these are federal officials who are unappointed, or they're appointed, they're unelected, and there's so much of that that's happening now. Law is being made from the bench, and Harry Reid now is at the point where he can start putting in attorneys or judges that he thinks are going to push towards the big government side of the equation. One good example is just last week the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, tried to have, back in December 2010, they put out a bunch of regulations to regulate the internet. Fortunately, just last week, the District Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. struck that down and said, no, you overstepped your bounds, which is great. It keeps the internet free. It keeps the government's hands off the internet. But if Harry Reid has his way, now there's there's a Republican majority on that court right now, but now that the nuclear option has been triggered, he has the authority to start packing Democrats in there. And when in the future, it's not clear that you're going to get the same results from these courts as you get today. You may get courts that are advocating more power to the Federal Communications Commission. You may get courts that are advocating more power to the EPA. And unfortunately, we've already seen some of that, and I think that only gets worse unless we go out there and really push for an administration that supports open markets and competition, and a Congress that does and will appoint the judges that keeps the regulatory state in stride. Because just in sort of final look at this and why I think it's a real problem that has really not been addressed by our side, and at Freedom Works we're going to start a project that's going to do a lot more looking into this issue. But the the APA, the guys that do the Administrative Procedure Act, these are the lawyers that follow the regulations. They say there's like 10,000 regulations out there. And so any day of the week, any one of us could be doing something that violates some regulation somewhere. And we don't know it. But the state has the power now, because of all these regulations, because the administrative state and the regulatory state has become so big, that they have a lot more power over our lives than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So moving forward, I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic in the sense that it's going to take grassroots from the outside of Washington to move in and say, we want, let's go back to the Constitution, let's go back to a limited government, and let's go back to a country that promotes entrepreneurship instead of pushing it overseas. Thank you, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.